The second factor that I want to explore concerns activists' experiences on the ground organising civil rights activity and projects during the first half of the 1960s. During the first half of the 1960s, as activists with groups like SNCC and CORE worked at the local level to try to bring change to the American South, they became radicalised by their experiences. As well as losing some faith in the federal government, they also came to question non-violence and the usefulness of interracial organising. As the historian Timothy B. Tyson has shown, there was a deep-rooted tradition of armed self-defence in the rural South. Many black Southerners who lived in small towns and communities across the South not only owned guns, typically rifles, but they were also prepared to use them to protect their homes, their families, and their communities. And it was this reality that civil rights activists, often trained in and committed to non-violence, encountered when they sought to register black voters and organise civil rights campaigns at the local level. Non-violent activists soon learned that the commitment to self-defence was strong. As SNCC's Bob Moses explained, self-defence is so deeply ingrained in rural Southern America that we as a small group can't affect it. Living with local families, many activists began to question their own commitment to non-violence as they wrestled with whether or not to persuade their host not to stand guard at night, wondered whether it was acceptable for them to take up an offer of armed protection, and had to decide whether, as polite guests, they should offer to take a turn with the rifle. By the middle of the 1960s, in large part because of such experiences, many civil rights activists had given up on non-violence and instead accepted armed self-defence. There was a similar radicalising effect when it came to the question of interracial organising. While the civil rights movement during the late 1950s and early 1960s enjoyed the important support of a large number of liberal whites, there were relatively few whites involved in grassroots organising at the local level. This changed in 1964 with the Mississippi Freedom Summer, which saw hundreds of whites descend on Mississippi, and many of them stayed on afterwards. This influx of whites into the movement caused problems, putting a great strain on black-white relations, and ultimately helped lead to both SNCC and CORE deciding to become black-only organisations. So what sort of problems did white involvement cause? Firstly, many of these white activists came from privileged backgrounds. They had relatively wealthy parents, they studied at prestigious schools and universities, they were skilled, intelligent, articulate, and confident, and they saw themselves as leaders. It might have been unintentional, but they often intimidated black activists, who viewed whites as taking over their movement. Second problem involved interracial sex. Sexual relationships, especially between black men and white women, were intensely problematic for the civil rights movement. They caused tensions and jealousies, particularly resentment among black women, and they threatened to undermine the effectiveness of civil rights projects, especially if they were seized upon by white segregationists. Finally, there were growing worries that having whites organise blacks was actually part of the problem, not the solution. At root, the civil rights movement was about empowering African Americans and undermining often ingrained assumptions about white superiority. David Nolan, a white activist in Virginia, explained that blacks in the community where he was working had a hard time breaking down their own stereotypes about whites. He explained, "When Mr. Claiborne came over to get me for church, he was hesitant about coming in, hesitant about sitting down, always calling me Mr. or Sir." In 1965, CORE's Bill Bradley surveyed his organisation's southern projects. He concluded that too often the white worker becomes a crutch for members of the black community. Case after case of black dependency upon whites could be cited. The reasons are clear. We are used to depending upon white folks for practically everything. We are taught from birth that the white man is the greatest and a nigger ain't shit. Bradley concluded that the very independence we are trying to encourage is discouraged by the presence and activity of whites. The logic of all of this seemed to many to be that only blacks could free themselves, and that white involvement caused more harm than good. It helps to explain why both SNCC and CORE decided to become all-black organisations. In the summer of 1965, for example, before its decision to expel its white members, SNCC workers founded the Lowndes County Freedom Organisation in Alabama, an organisation designed to win political power for local African Americans. The All-Black Party took a black panther as its symbol. Finally, I want to turn my attention to some external issues that help to explain the radicalisation of the civil rights movement during the second half of the 1960s. I think the most important of these were the war in Vietnam and the urban riots. America deepened her military commitments in Vietnam during 1965 and 1966, sending tens of thousands of ground troops and engaging in a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. In these same years, African Americans appeared to be fighting and dying in Vietnam, in particularly high numbers. In the mid-1960s, blacks accounted for about 20% of those drafted to fight in Vietnam, but they made up only 10% of the American population. In 1967, 20% of all American casualties in Vietnam were African American. That same year, 64% of eligible blacks were drafted, but only 31% of eligible whites. And blacks weren't represented on draft boards. In 1966, they made up just 1.3% of draft board membership. Particularly in the South, the draft was used against civil rights activists. Mississippi's James Jolliff, an epileptic, found his draft status upgraded from 4F to 1A, thereby making him eligible to serve in Vietnam, after he became president of his local NAACP chapter, for example. Many civil rights activists also viewed the war as a non-white struggle against white imperialism and expressed solidarity for America's enemy, the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong, who they viewed as freedom fighters, seeking a unified and independent Vietnam. As one SNCC activist put it, "You know, I just saw one of those Viet Cong guerrillas on TV. He was dark-skinned, ragged, poor and angry. I swear, he looked just like one of us." As the war continued to escalate, despite the substantial efforts of the peace movement, some civil rights activists became disillusioned and bitter. They saw America's actions in Vietnam, particularly the use of napalm, as illustrating a wider lack of respect for non-white people. In short, they came to see the war in Vietnam as a racist product of a racist government. The second external factor I want to talk about are the urban riots. 5 days after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, rioting erupted in the Watts district of Los Angeles. Lasting for 4 days, it cost 34 lives, most of them black, injured 1,000, and destroyed an estimated $45 million worth of property. Watts marked the start of 3 years of long, hot summers. In 1966, there were 43 riots, the most serious of which was a 4-day riot in Cleveland. In the summer of 1967, Tampa, Cincinnati, Atlanta, Newark, and Detroit all suffered serious urban unrest. The 6 days of rioting in Newark, for example, cost 23 lives, and 43 were killed in Detroit. In 1968, the murder of Martin Luther King led to riots in more than 100 American cities, at the cost of 46 lives and more than $100 million worth in property damage. Now, these urban riots seem to indicate that America's racial problems went far deeper than segregation and the denial of the right to vote, and that the problems of the northern cities, problems of police brutality, poverty, crime, and informal discrimination, would require a new approach. New groups emerged, such as the Black Panther Party, that sought to organise urban blacks and proposed new solutions, embracing armed self-defence and using militant rhetoric. they sought black control of local communities and institutions, and at times even urged separatism. Established civil rights figures were also affected. In addition to condemning America's actions in Vietnam, for example, Martin Luther King, during the last 3 years of his life, was also deeply critical of American capitalism. He attacked American society's excessive materialism and called for a redistribution of America's wealth. To conclude, in many ways, the radicalisation of the civil rights movement, the rejection of non-violence, the abandonment of interracialism, and the adoption of harsh rhetoric emerged out of the Southern struggle itself, as activists learned lessons, became disillusioned, and began to explore alternative strategies. As civic leader James Forman explained, 5 years of struggle had radically changed many people. It had changed them from idealistic reformers to full-time revolutionaries, and the change had come through direct experience. But the growth of black power at the end of the 1960s was also the result of new developments, especially the war in Vietnam, and the growing realisation that the racial problems of the urban north were significantly different to those of the rural south, and therefore required a new approach.